Good evening, everybody. I hope I am unmuted. I hope my voice reaches you. Thank you for sticking with us. I'm Michael Waldman. I am the president of the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Welcome to this Brennan Center live event. Before we get started, I'm going to do the part where in person I would tell you to turn off your cell phones. I'm not telling you to do that, maybe someday soon, but a few housekeeping notes. First of all, we're going to leave time for questions at the end of this discussion. If you have a question, please feel free to add what you want to ask to the chat in YouTube or in Facebook. And second, and this should go without saying, civility is important, very important to all of us at the Brennan Center. Those of us who post, those of you, anybody who posts or puts up intemperate language in our message streams here on YouTube or Facebook will be removed from the conversation. And finally, we will provide and do provide closed captioning, live closed captioning. For those of you who don't know and who are joining us for the first time, the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute. We work to strengthen, to renew, and when necessary, to defend the systems of democracy and justice in this country so they work for all. Those goals are always important, and they are especially urgent now. We know that our democracy faces challenges in so many ways. We know that our Constitution is being interpreted by the courts in ways that choke off rights and forestall equality and point the country in a backward direction. And we know that our criminal justice system is a system that is rife with issues demanding action, demanding reform, demanding a better way. At the Brennan Center, through our justice program and other parts of our organization, we work to end mass incarceration in the United States. We continue to be struck by the bitter fact that we as a country have less than 5% of the world's population, but nearly 25% of its prison population. Mass incarceration has crushing consequences, social, racial, and economic, and it is not necessary, we believe, to keep our communities safe. We emphatically insist that we can have public safety and public order and fairness and accountability at the same time. Those are false choices. And to that end, we are really especially excited to have the chance to talk about this important new book by Bill Keller. The book is What is Prison For? And we are happy to be doing this with Bill Keller, who was a leader in the field on criminal justice as the founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, a really pioneering journalistic effort to look at the criminal justice system. And I will say, as a point of personal privilege, I'm especially delighted to be doing this because this book is published by Columbia Global Reports, a nonprofit publisher on whose board I sit. I encourage you, if I may shill for Columbia Global Reports for a minute, I encourage you to take a look at all the books it publishes. They're compact, they're powerful, and they address some of the most interesting and important issues facing the country and the world today. Now, we will be live tweeting today's event. Please follow the conversation at hashtag Brennan Center Live. And without further ado, I'm really pleased that our moderator for this evening is Jason D. Williamson, the executive director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at NYU School of Law, the wonderful academic institution we're so thrilled to partner with. Before coming to NYU, Jason spent over a decade as a staff attorney and as deputy director of the ACLU's Criminal Law Reform Project. Jason, thank you for being part of this, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thank you so much to all of you for being here. Thank you to the Brennan Center for having me and for putting on this event. I'm really excited about our conversation, and I know we have a lot of ground to cover with our guests, so we're gonna dive right into tonight's program. As many of you are aware, and as Michael alluded to, there are roughly 2 million people behind bars in the United States at any given time. which is what kept me so busy for so long at the ACLU, and the work continues. And as you may also know, and as Michael also mentioned, that means that 25% of the world's incarcerated population resides in this country, even though the US makes up just 5% of the world's population. Given that dire state of affairs, calls for prison reform and even prison abolition have become central to our collective efforts to reimagine the criminal legal system and demand change. That said, while I think we can all agree that there are many things wrong with the current system, our guest tonight explores the question of whether there is anything going right within our prison system. To put it another way, are America's prisons, which of course have never been bastions of empathy or rehabilitation, for that matter, finally inching in the right direction? As Michael noted, the Brennan Center is no stranger to this work. The Center's Justice Program has reported extensively on how America's criminal legal system is unduly harsh, and has developed solutions to transition toward a more just system. So that brings us to our guest for the evening. Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Bill Keller has spent many years examining what is possible if prisons decide to focus their attention on preparing incarcerated people to be productive citizens when they return to society, as the overwhelming majority of them will. In his new book, again entitled What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration, Bill outlines the steps prisons should take to emphasize rehabilitation, which will ultimately benefit people both inside and outside of prison. Mr. Keller is a tireless reporter. He's been doing this for many years. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him and his work. He also serves as the founding editor of the Marshall Project, which has been a personal gift to me on a daily basis, and is also the former executive editor of the New York Times. Welcome, Bill. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So before we jump into the substance of the book, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah, I spent 5 years immersed in the subject of criminal justice along with my great colleagues at the Marshall Project. And when I emerged from that experience, I felt like I had learned a few things that I might want to share with the rest of the world. I focused on prisons because they're the most mysterious and least transparent of the agencies that deal with criminal justice issues. Police do a lot of work in the open and have come under intense scrutiny, rightly so. Courts do a lot of work in the open. Judges and prosecutors often have to run for public office, so they're available to be challenged. But prisons, the walls not only keep people in, they keep people out. And I think there are probably a lot of people who are fine with that, they don't particularly want to know what goes on to those people on the other side of the wall. So I thought I would try to put mass incarceration in some context and focus on the incarceration part rather than the mass part. Mass incarceration, I mean, the numbers which both Jason and Michael have cited to you are alarming, but we know how to reduce the population of the incarcerated population in this country if we have the political will. There's not much debate about how you do it, although there's considerable debate about whether you do it. But the incarceration part of it is still a little secretive. And so I thought I would try to do a primer on what prison is for, where it falls short of those aspirations.
I appreciate that, and I think you're certainly right that while it may be a policy decision to sort of keep everything that happens behind the prison walls secret, I think a lot of folks in this country would sign up for that and don't necessarily have any interest in knowing what's going on behind bars. So I appreciate you doing what you can to try to bring some attention to this. So let's start broadly in terms of what you learned and what you discovered over the course of your time studying the prison system, and in the lead up to this book, what did you discover are really some of the sort of defining characteristics of the American justice system, and in particular, the prison system in this country?
I came to think of the defining purpose of the defining story of prisons as being this tension between punishment and rehabilitation. Rehabilitation has a history in this country, at least as an aspiration that goes back 200 years. This country pretty much invented the modern penitentiary using the word penitence to underscore that this was not just to punish, but it was also to give people a chance to redeem themselves. Rehabilitation has often been more ignored than applied, but it's still there. I mean, the desire for it, we talk about it a lot. Punishment is the other force between these two forces, and it seems to be something we brought over with the Puritans. There's a kind of a mean streak, and it's not just nasty right-wing bigots who believe in severe punishment. Who among us has not felt a little tingle of pleasure at hearing Bernie Madoff sentenced to 150 years in prison, or the cop who killed George Floyd being indicted? We all have a little bit of the punishment gene in us as well. So I framed the book as a tension between those two forces.
So I want to follow up on that a little bit. This question about rehabilitation and it being kind of one of the foundational principles in this country around what prisons are supposed to be for. It seems to me, and we talked about, the myriad problems and deficiencies in our system. I wonder, and we'll talk about the details of the different programs and things that are happening in prisons across the country, but how difficult do you think it is, generally speaking, to help folks rehabilitate in the context of a setting that is traumatic on a day-to-day basis, just in terms of going from point A to point B. If you're a person who's living your life in prison, how do you deal with that while you're also trying to somehow rehabilitate yourself and prepare to leave the facility at some point?
Right. Well, rehabilitation faces a lot of challenges, including the mean streak that I referred to earlier. The cost, rehabilitation is more expensive than just letting people rot in their cells. But you've alluded to one of the major problems with rehabilitation, which is that prisons are not great therapeutic environments. They're scary, they're tense, they're noisy. There's a kind of culture in a lot of prisons that you're some sort of a sellout if you try to better yourself. And on top of that, the staff of prisons is not trained to do remedial work or social work. They're much more like paramilitary force. They're there to keep control. So in order to overcome those obstacles, you've got to be willing to invest some money and retrain staff. And that's a hard sell.
Indeed. Now, and as you write in your book, it's the way that prisons are set up in this country and the kind of environment that is created in American prisons is not sort of inherent necessarily in prisons, right? And you looked at what's happening at prisons in other parts of the world, particularly in Europe. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what prisons are like in Europe and how much you think that approach can or will be imported into this country, because it seems to me that it's not just that the facilities themselves look different and feel different. It's that there's a different mentality, a different approach to punishment or rehabilitation that has led folks in other parts of the world to think differently about what prisons should look like. So how do we get to that point, both in terms of what the facilities look like, but I guess more importantly, how do we change the mentality such that folks think it makes sense to go down that road rather than continuing to do what we're doing here?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not just an infrastructure difference between Europe and the United States. It's a philosophical difference. There's been a lot of exchange programs, mostly Scandinavian countries, and also Germany, who have had delegations of corrections officials from the US visit them, and in some cases have sent people over to shadow our correctional officers and give them some guidance. The philosophy, to oversimplify a little bit, is that punishment is the deprivation of freedom. The fact that you are separated from your family and your community and locked up, that is the punishment. Punishment does not incorporate being raped in the shower, being beaten by the guards, being locked in solitary confinement. Those are excesses of harsh treatment. So first of all, it's the philosophy that you retain your humanity and your rights, including, by the way, the right to vote, while you're undergoing this period of isolation. Second of all, the job of the prison is to essentially diagnose what led you into a life of crime and to help you address those issues while we have you in custody. We're going to help you do anger management or get an education or whatever it will take for you to be a good citizen and neighbor when you are released, which, by the way, 95% of prisoners currently locked up will be released one of these days. And the other striking difference between the United States and the countries that I've referred to is the role of staff. To be a correctional officer in most places in the United States, you'll get a few weeks of training in crowd control, self-defense. In Germany, if you're going to be a correctional officer, you're going to do 2 years of college-level study, including human rights law and psychology. And your assignment is not to go in and just play a paramilitary role. It's to engage the prisoners, to sense when something is going wrong with them, with their lives, so that you can help address it before it turns into violence. Now, obviously, the United States is not Norway. Norway is a racially homogeneous, oil-rich welfare state, and we're not. But I've talked to corrections officers, reform-minded corrections officers in several states that have tried to mesh up with their European counterparts, and they're not trying to replicate Norway's conditions in New York or California, but they're trying to apply the general philosophy that this is a time when you can set people straight so that they can rejoin the real world.
Appreciate that. I'm going to come back to that shortly, but I'm curious. I mentioned earlier that the Brennan Center does a lot of work on this topic, and they've developed an important series of essays called Punitive Excess, highlighting how across a range of issues, U.S. policymakers have prioritized excess punishment over the more supportive and less traumatic ways of dealing with social harm that we're talking about here. And so I'm curious, in conducting the research for your book, did you come across punitive excess in the U.S. justice system as a concept, and how difficult do you think that is to overcome if we're going to get to that sort of change in mentality that you're talking about?
Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but just about everything about the U.S. criminal justice system is about excessive punitive excess. We are one of the few developed countries that still has a death penalty. we're one of the few that has life without chance of parole. We have laws that set mandatory minimum sentences. In Scandinavia, you're more likely to find mandatory maximum sentences. We have 3 strikes laws, some of which have been repealed, but not all of them. We pile on the punishment at each step along the way.
Fair enough. Obviously, you have been able to identify facilities around the country that are, in fact, engaging in some at least helpful programming that is having positive effects on some of the folks that are inside. I wonder if you could say a little bit about some of the more significant success stories that you encountered doing the reporting for your book.
Yeah, I don't want to sound too optimistic. I'm not just the bearer of good news. There's plenty of bad news about the criminal justice system. The good news is that there are people who are trying, and the heroes of my little book are the reform-minded correctional officials and politicians who have braved being called soft on crime to try out new things. They're the educators who teach college, particularly college classes, which have been proven to reduce recidivism rates. They're the volunteers who work in prisons helping maintain family ties so that when people get out of prison, they're not left completely without family support. There are interesting programs all around the country. One that I was intrigued by in Texas, it's called the Prison Entrepreneurship Program, where they take promising prisoners, set them up in a separate unit of the prison, and do essentially a master's in business administration mini course for them. The aim being that when they're released, they'll be able to, if not start their own business, work for somebody who has got a small business. And I've read some of the research on it. Baylor University did a good study of their work. They've processed more than 2,800 prisoners. 40% of them own their own homes. 20% of them own their own businesses. The recidivism rate is 8% compared to 23% for Texas as a whole. The criminal justice system can't be reformed just by making the prisons better. The prisons are the catch basin for all of the other societal shortcomings: poverty, racism, lack of housing, lack of jobs. The failures of those systems. Until you can figure out a way to improve those systems, prison is going to remain the kind of drain that the failures flow down. But the heroes of my book are the people who try against the odds to make the system a little better.
So I appreciate that, and I think you've sort of touched on this a little bit, but I want to go back to what you said at the top of your response, which is sort of, not wanting to get overly excited about some of the things happening, given all of the work that still needs to be done. As you know, there are a lot of folks who have become quite disillusioned with the idea of prison reform as a concept, and have sort of moved toward a vision of prison abolition instead. I think about even the program that you just described, which sounds fantastic, and makes you wonder why such a program couldn't be offered to folks outside of the prison wall, and makes you wonder how much programs like that could serve as a preventative measure for folks in communities that have been historically oppressed. So I'm curious how you respond to the argument that no amount of reform is going to fix our prison system, and that really all we're doing is sort of tinkering at the edges if we're trying to fix what's going on inside of these facilities.
Yeah, that's a good question, because the abolitionist movement is arguably the fastest growing component of the anti-prison movement. I think first, I've read a lot of the abolitionist literature, and I think, first of all, they deserve a lot of credit for having been early to recognize the shortcomings of the system as it exists and draw attention to the failures, both the failures of the system that leads people into prison and the failures of the prison themselves to make us safer or to satisfy any other legitimate purpose. I have two concerns about abolition. One of them is in this new world, if you could get to the ideal world that the abolitionists prescribe, you're still going to have rules and laws in society. And I'm a little uneasy with the idea that we would deal with them as a sort of crowdsourcing issue, that some unspecified mob of the public would decide the fate of people who've broken the rules. And the other concern is that kind of reform, if it happens, is going to take generations because the system changes slowly. And what do you do with all the people who are being victimized by the system in the meantime? I think there are, nearly 2 million people who are waking up every morning in cells, and I can't imagine saying to them, just wait until the revolution comes and you won't have to be in a cage anymore.
No, I think that's fair, and that is an ongoing conversation about what to build in place of the things that may need to be torn down. We have a number of questions in the chat, which I want to make sure we get to. I did want to ask you one question that I think is maybe related to one of the questions, which is you write a lot about the various second chance programs being offered inside of prisons, from religious study and counseling to education and meditation. And of course, there's extensive public debate and disagreement about the extent to which those programs are effective. So I'm just wondering, after all the time that you've spent reporting on the prison system, what do you think is working and what's not? And then related to that, someone asked a question about how the restorative justice movement might sort of be woven into all of this, and whether you think that's a viable alternative.
Sorry, intervention from my wife. Restorative justice is a really interesting issue. I've talked a lot to Danielle Sered, who runs Common Justice and who has done a lot of restorative justice with the Brooklyn DA's office. And the idea is that rather than having a trial or a settlement, with the approval of the judge and the victims, you sit down the victims and the victimizers for a serious conversation about what could be done, what was the impact of the violence, what could be done to restore the people who have been victimized, what kind of consequences should there be, and with the blessing of a judge, they sort of negotiate their way to a solution that's more customized than what you would get in just a trial. There are a couple of obvious difficulties with that. One of them is it's hard to scale because you have multiple meetings that involve often victims and perpetrators and other people that they bring into the mix. And it's politically sensitive. It takes a pretty brave district attorney to be willing to, I mean, even in Brooklyn where they've had some success with this program, they don't do rapes or murders. But there's another use that restorative justice is put to, and that is in prisons. I talked to one prisoner in San Quentin who I've done some mentoring with, who said that one of the most profound experiences he had was a restorative justice program where he was brought together, not with the victim of his crime, but hold on, I've got to turn the phone off. Anyway, he was brought together with somebody who had experienced a similar crime, been victimized by a similar crime. And he said it was just profound the shame that he felt in that restorative justice program. Sorry about the phone.
You're a popular guy tonight, so.
I'm on a group call. I'll tell you later. Sorry.
So I appreciate that, because I was going to ask whether you thought there was a way to import restorative justice principles to inside the prison itself, as opposed to just being an alternative beforehand. So that's interesting that at least in some facilities that seems to be happening.
Right.
There are a bunch of really good questions in the chat. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all of them, but I want to ask you another sort of program-related question. Assuming you were able to or have been able to visit both government-run and privately run institutions, did you notice any differences in the programming between those prisons that were privately owned and those that were owned by either the state or the federal government?
I have not visited a private prison, but Shane Bauer, excellent reporter for Mother Jones, wrote a book a couple of years ago where he enlisted as a prison guard in a private prison. And it's an excellent book. He talks about the history of profiteering, and profit and incarceration don't just come together in private prisons. There's a long history of starting with after Reconstruction. A lot of places in the South, with slavery abolished, substituted indentured servitude as the criminal penalty. So sort of the era of slavery, new era of Jim Crow. And that work was contracted out to private people who profited from it. And although it's a fairly small minority of federal and state prisons that are now privately managed, Shane Bauer found that there was much more focus on the bottom line in the privately run prisons. And even the publicly run prisons have components of capitalism associated with them. They contract out the medical services, transportation services, telecommunications services, cafeteria services, uniforms. So there are even in the state-run and federally run prisons, there's a fair amount of profit to be made.
And I imagine that, that could have an impact on the quality of the programming at those facilities, right? If either the government or the private owner of the facility thinks that those programs are going to cut into their profit margin, then they may not offer those programs, or they'll offer some watered down version that may not be as helpful.
Right. Well, and on top of that, if you get paid to run a private prison, sort of the way hotels get paid by occupancy rate. So you have no incentive to get people out of prison, rehabilitated and rejoining society. It's a full bunk is a bunk that pays.
That's right. Another, what I think is a really good question, which is based on your research and your experience, how has the definition of rehabilitation changed over time? And then sort of I'm adding this, which is, do you think it needs to change in order to sort of help people reimagine what it means to rehabilitate folks, and what kind of tools and resources people need in order to find success once they are released?
Well, I want to be careful about overgeneralizing. There's a saying that prison officials have that if you've seen one prison, you've seen one prison. Everyone has its own culture and its own shortcomings and features. So now I've lost track of the question.
Well, I'm sure that's true, and I guess I just mean, generally speaking, do you think there's a difference in the way that people view what is required if you're really going to rehabilitate someone now versus what folks may have thought about that question, 20, 30 years ago? Or do you think we're sort of stuck in a place where either there's no sort of one definition of what rehabilitation is or means, or if, generally speaking, the public is not especially concerned about how to define rehabilitation?
Well, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, prison rehabilitation has ebbed and flowed over the years. We had periods of progressive government when rehabilitation was embraced, and then we had up until the beginning of the 70s or so, the sharp punitive turn, which included a rejection of rehabilitation. I think rehabilitation, the idea of it is staging something of a comeback now. I don't want to overstate that because I don't want to be overly optimistic. But I do think there's a lot more discussion about starting rehabilitation early when people are incarcerated, emphasis on their specific needs rather than just treating everybody generically. But again, you can't generalize. There are prisons that are located in urban areas, like San Quentin near Marin County, or Sing Sing in Westchester County, where they tend to have more enlightened superintendents and a lot more volunteers available to do rehab. And then you get places that are hundreds of miles away from the cities. And they don't, you can wait 6 months to get into an Alcoholics Anonymous program.
Right. Thank you for that. Another question, the question is, what are the statistics on recidivism in the U.S. and how do other countries differ? And I guess just to connect that to the larger conversation, how do you see those recidivism rates affecting our political will to make the kinds of changes that you think are necessary inside of prisons? It seems to me it could go both ways, right? People could read those statistics as, sort of saying these folks are hopeless and we shouldn't spend additional money trying to provide programming and so forth because they're just going to get released and commit more crimes. Or maybe a more enlightened view that, to the extent that we invest more resources into rehabilitation, our recidivism rates are likely to decline. And that may be the case in places like Europe or otherwise, but curious about your thoughts on recidivism and how it fits into the conversation.
Sure. There are lots of different ways of measuring recidivism. You can do it on a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year span. Some people count any arrest as a recidivism. Some people wait to see if you're convicted or actually resent to prison. But one widely used number, and it's a pretty damning one, is that 2/3 of the people released from prison are rearrested again within 5 years. That is not a sign of a successful rehabilitation program. I would argue that that's the case for rehabilitation. It's not that rehabilitation is leading people to a life of crime. On the contrary, there's considerable academic research that suggests that prison makes some people more likely to commit crimes by giving them sort of an alien attitude towards authority, and of course by sending them home with no skills to earn a living.
Right.
You asked also about European prisons.
I just wonder if there's any hard evidence that there is a correlation between the facilities that are actually taking real strides to help folks rehabilitate themselves and recidivism rates. I mean, so for example, some of the facilities that you highlight in your book, and it may be too soon to tell, but do we know whether those facilities have fewer people recidivating and coming back to prison than those that aren't engaging in some of that programming?
Yeah. The best research I've seen is deals with education in prison. Rand Corporation has done a kind of meta study where they gathered a lot of other studies of recidivism and how it was affected by people getting an education while they were behind bars, specifically a college education. And the results are pretty dramatic. And I don't think too many people dispute. I mean, there are people who think we shouldn't give college to prison inmates because they're prison inmates and they deserve to be punished. But there's nobody suggesting with evidence that college doesn't make them less likely to return to a life of crime.
Right. And one other rehabilitation-related question. One of our viewers asked, does prison rehabilitation have trauma-informed conversations as an essential element? So I'm assuming that means, for people who are going through this programming in a given facility, are they talking explicitly about the trauma that they're experiencing, or the trauma that they experienced before they got to prison that may be one of the reasons that landed them there? Do you have a sense of whether folks are sort of dealing with that head on?
Yes, there are a number of facilities that deal with trauma, not nearly enough, because as the questioner implies, and rightly so, people who are in prison are much more likely to have experienced childhood trauma, sexual trauma. That's even more true of the women prisoners, who make up about 10% of the prison population. But it's erratic. Again, prison officers aren't trained in dealing with such issues. They're there mostly to keep order, and hiring skilled therapists, while I would probably argue it would be worth the cost, it is a cost, and money is one of the biggest problems in getting rehabilitation going.
We've talked here and there about sort of wanting to temper any enthusiasm about what's happening inside of these prisons. But I wonder if you think there is a case for, just based on your research, is there a case for cautious optimism right now when it comes to the way that our prisons operate? Or do you think, the programs that you were able to identify are, not indicative of where prisons and sort of the prison system is headed in the years ahead?
Well, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that the paralysis that's hit Washington during the Trump years has silenced a lot of relatively conservative public officials who supported reforms, because we're now going into a midterm election and presumably a presidential election where crime is the big issue, and the being tough on crime is going to be a merit badge for a lot of candidates. So we can hope that isn't a permanent condition, but just the mood of the country at the moment. The good news is, first of all, most of the incarceration takes place at the state level, not at the federal level, and different states have tried different things with some success to embrace rehabilitation. That's one call. For example, President Trump signed a bill that included restoring access to Pell Grants, college grants for incarcerated people. That's a program that was cut off in the 1994 Crime Act by a tough-on-crime bipartisan majority that included President Clinton and Joe Biden, who was then chairman of the Judiciary Committee.
Got it. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact that, different states have approached this differently. One of the questions that I did not get to was, make sure I can find it here. It's just a question about whether there are any states that are doing this particularly well or better than other states. And if so, how might you explain those differences?
There are several I could point to. Two that I'll name are Oregon and North Dakota. Oregon, which is a blue state, is probably not surprising that it would be a reform-minded state. North Dakota is a pretty red state, but it happened to have a couple of relatively enlightened directors of corrections. And in both of those states, they've engaged very closely with Norwegians and Swedes, exchange programs, study programs, discussions, and they've tried to change their hiring practices so that they're hiring people who want to be involved in prisons for the right reasons, not just for a paycheck. Both places are doing a lot of retraining of their staff to teach them more human skills and less paramilitary skills.
And I have some things floating around in my head, but any idea why those two states in particular you think have been more receptive to that approach?
Yeah, it's leadership. And it requires a willingness to change and the courage to stand up to the political foes who oppose you. One advantage they had in North Dakota is that the prison guards are not unionized. In several states, commissioners who wanted to try something new were stymied by strong unions that just wanted to protect the status quo.
Interesting. One of the things that occurred to me when you mentioned the Norwegian example, you pointed out that one of the big differences between this country and Norway is that it's homogeneous, right, for the most part, and we are not. But those two states, I think, have relatively small populations of folks of color, and I just wonder whether there's any correlation there, whether states that have a larger population of Black and brown people in prison would be willing to consider these sorts of alternatives. So I'm not necessarily asking you to comment, but I just wonder.
Well, there's a chapter in my book that's entitled "What's Race Got to Do with It?" And a three-word answer. I spent a few pages on it, but a three-word answer is just about everything. I mean, every step along the way of the criminal justice system, from cops frisking people on the street to people condemned to death row, Black Americans are way disproportionately represented. Blacks make up 13% of the American population, and nearly 40% of the incarcerated population. And so, yes, I would say your speculation about the racial makeup having something to do with their openness to reform there's something to that.
Thanks for that, Bill. So I know we're coming up on time, and thank you again for everybody who asked questions. I don't know if we were able to get to all of them, but I think that's most of them. I wanted to make sure I asked you one last question before we finish, which is, can you tell us what is one thing that you want our viewers to walk away with this evening as it relates to your work and your book?
Well, one thing I'd like viewers to take away is the idea that rehabilitation is not a favor that we do for the incarcerated or a gift of some kind, but it's an investment. It's an investment in human potential and in public safety.
And there seems to be evidence that it works, right? Mm-hmm. If you're willing to put the time and resources into making sure that folks have what they need to succeed. Bill, thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you for all of the investigative work you've done over the years and in connection with this book. And thank you for writing it and helping us to think about this a little more critically. And I never thought I'd have the opportunity to thank you directly for the Marshall Project, which, as I said, is something that has added a lot of value to my life since it started. So I appreciate all your efforts in the field, and keep up the great work. And folks who are interested in the book, can you say a little about where they can find the book?
Just about anywhere they sell books, Amazon, etc.
Got it. And again, the full title of the book is What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Same here. And a quick note from the Brennan Center before we leave you. Stay up to date on key issues impacting our democracy with weekly analysis and insight from Brennan Center experts. You can sign up for Brennan Center newsletters at brennancenter.org/subscribe. Again, my name is Jason Williamson. I am the Executive Director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law here at NYU Law School. Thank you for coming and supporting the work of the Brennan Center for Justice. And Bill, thank you once again. Have a great night, everybody.